The most iconic Japanese fashion brands are deeply misunderstood outside of Japan. And the most exciting chapter of their story is not the 80s or the 90s, it's right now. This new generation is more collaborative, more fearless with their references, and more globally relevant than anything that came before. Almost nobody outside Tokyo has filmed it properly. 10 days on the ground, dozens of stores, the city kept showing me that the new wave wasn't coming. It was already fully formed and had been for years. Here is the most complete curated film on Tokyo's new wave that currently exists anywhere. Let's start. My train is heading to Aoyama, starting my journey at my favorite district. I started at the Issey Miyake Aoyama store because this brand is different from everything that came before in Japanese fashion history. Yoji and Comme des Garçons were building a dark, anti-fashion universe. Issey was asking a completely different question. What happens when fashion meets technology, design, sculpture, and everyday life all at once? Steve Jobs understood this before most people in fashion did. He ended up ordering 100 of those black turtlenecks for himself and wore the same one at every single Apple launch until the end of his life. The most powerful brand builder of his generation picked one Japanese designer. Every new wave brand in this episode owes something to what Issey proved was possible. That's why we start here. Sakai became a hallmark of new wave Japanese design by turning hybridity into brand DNA. Utility, tailoring, disruption. Not trends, but a system. That's why its influence reaches far beyond fashion. Then I noticed the carpet. It felt strangely personal. A design code I once built into Le Benjamin, now reappearing inside Sakai. From there, I moved to Toga, a brand I always admired for turning contradiction into a design language, masculine and feminine, order and disruption, all held inside one brand system. After I found Yuichi Aoyama, a brand I had never known before coming to Tokyo. Yet everything felt instantly familiar. The store, the materials, the objects, all of it spoke my language. Their eyewear feels less like fashion and more like architecture for the face. Afterwards, I took the train to Omotesando to visit Porter, one of Japan's most interesting accessory brand known for its bags. What makes Porter special is not just utility, but how they turn function into culture. Every pocket, zip, fabric, and stitch feels considered. It is craftsmanship, but without shouting luxury. And I love when brands leave smart clues for their customers. An underground photography book, a Sun Ra record. Suddenly you are not just shopping, you are entering the intellectual universe of the brand. What impressed me most was how Porter explains the story behind each product. Most brands expect you to understand fabrics, production, and design by yourself. But here, every bag invites you into its journey of creation. You understand why it exists, not just what it costs. I found chaos almost by accident, but it felt like a lesson in retail world building. The industrial interior, the material contrasts, where the brand's own identity sits in dialogue with local designers. Omotesando Hills became one of my favorite places in Tokyo, designed by Tadao Ando. Even the building feels like a brand statement, and inside I found the Tokyo, one of the most memorable retail experiences of my trip. What I loved was the Tokyo is a multi-brand showroom, bringing together some of the most interesting Japanese designers, from N.Hoolywood and Ujo to Sulwam and Tunc, while also developing a strong private label of its own. What made it unforgettable was the person working there. He spoke about each designer with real passion, almost like a curator guiding me through an exhibition. I ended up leaving with several pieces, including pieces from their own line, and one of my favorite discoveries from the trip, Rainmaker from Kyoto. Inside the same building, I found another brand I was curious to experience, Maison Mihara Yashuhiro. I wanted to try its signature shoes for years. What stayed with me wasn't just the product, but how the store turned creation itself into part of the retail experience. Sketches, process, experimentation. The brand felt inside out, inviting you into its core DNA. From there, I jumped to Nanamika, a brand I admire for making utility feel elegant. I loved the warmth of the Daikanyama store, all wood and designer speakers. Founded in 2003, Nanamika was shaping the fashion function crossover long before Gorpcore had a name, turning technical innovation into quiet intelligence. Then I went to the long-awaited Ambush workshop flagship store. What many people don't realize is Ambush began as an experimental jewelry project before becoming a full fashion label, making it a fascinating brand study. Walking through the flagship, you could feel that DNA everywhere, from objects to space. It reminded me why Ambush became one of the rare Japanese brands with global cultural gravity, and how a founder's personal brand can become an engine for the brand itself. Next was &Wonder, a brand I admire for turning outdoor gear into design language. Founded by two former Issey Miyake designers, you can feel that mix of utility and beauty everywhere. On the next corner, I found N.Hoolywood, a brand that turns vintage Americana and military references into something deeply Japanese. Nubian felt less like a store and more like a cultural filter. The brand mix was incredible, but what stayed with me was how carefully everything was curated. You could feel Nubian acting almost like a cultural editor, selecting what feels relevant now from around the world. One of my biggest discoveries in this trip was Public Tokyo. What fascinated me was their idea of making Japanese craftsmanship feel accessible, where price and quality almost feel out of proportion. I ended up buying several pieces because the value was hard to ignore. It felt like a rare case where strong design, local production, and intelligent pricing all meet in one brand. Another highlight was Roppongi Hills, a shopping complex I loved for how seamlessly it blends fashion, architecture, and culture. Inside, I found one of the best United Arrows stores I visited in Tokyo. What amazed me is how they make simplicity feel authored. The details, fabrics, and proportions carry a quiet sophistication I rarely see outside Japan. It made me realize many Western basic brands can suddenly feel flat, Honestly, if United Arrows expanded globally at scale, they could challenge how Western brands think about everyday fashion. I stopped by Evisu, a legacy Osaka brand I always respected. Long before today's wave of Japanese fashion, Evisu helped prove a fashion label could resonate globally through denim culture and hip-hop. They showed Japanese fashion could export not just product but identity. From there, I went searching for GR8, this underground store hidden inside a local building that feels like only Harajuku insiders know. Walking in felt less like entering a shop and more like stepping into a cyberpunk movie set. Trees hanging from the ceiling, flickering televisions, strange futuristic textures. It looked like Ringu and Ghost in the Shell had a kid together inside a retail space. But beyond the atmosphere, what makes GR8 powerful is that it treats retail like experimentation. It doesn't just sell fashion, it stages worlds. Emerging designers sit beside cult labels, all filtered through a radical point of view. It reminded me the best stores don't feel transactional, they feel immersive. GR8 felt less like shopping and more like entering a subculture. While searching for the emerging label b.Eautiful, I discovered Domicile Tokyo, which became one of my favorite stores in Tokyo. The architecture, the music, the atmosphere, everything felt incredibly considered. It was one of those stores where the environment itself becomes part of the brand experience. And finding b.Eautiful there made it even better. I was drawn to how the brand blends Japanese sensibility with North American skate and graphic culture, creating something youthful but unusually thoughtful. I ended up buying a piece, partly to support a young startup I could imagine becoming much bigger. Crossing Harajuku, I found Not Conventional, one of those brands that asks for time but rewards attention, deconstructed, unconventional, almost anti-fashion in spirit. Finally, I arrived at my dream destination, Beams Japan Shinjuku. Easily my favorite Beams store in Tokyo. What I have always admired about Beams is that fashion is never the whole story. Codes and culture sit at the center of the brand. I discovered illustrators, references and underground labels like Cow Amped I might never have encountered otherwise. Entire floors are dedicated not just to clothing, but to Japanese craft, graphic design, music and objects. It made me think of Beams almost as a cultural institution, something like a Goethe Institute for Japanese culture, translating taste through fashion, books, objects, and sound. Beams doesn't just sell products, it circulates culture, and I have rarely seen any retailer do that at the scale Beams does in Tokyo. What struck me across every Beams store was how those ideas carry into retail itself. They even have Beams records, where music becomes part of the same worldview. Even the Harajuku flagship carried that spirit, especially the T-shirt lab, where something as everyday as a graphic tee becomes a platform for experimentation. That's what makes Beams special. Even basics become cultural artifacts. Continuair became my second great eyewear discovery in Tokyo. I learned about so many Japanese optical brands I had never heard of in my life. What I loved was how the store treated eyewear almost like design culture. For me, it's absolutely a must visit in Tokyo. My long-awaited final pilgrimage was Capital. For any designer, art director, or brand obsessive, this is a must. The store felt like a rebellion against how predictable retail has become. Everywhere you look, strange details, humor, craft, and contradictions keep revealing themselves. It felt like a Joker's answer to AI slop design. I have rarely seen a brand make playfulness feels this intelligent. And when I found a piece in my size only at the Ginza store, I had to make one last pilgrimage. So I crossed to Ginza to pick up the piece I had been dreaming about. And somehow it felt right that the journey ended up by chasing one last object. Walking back to my hotel, I realized this wasn't really about shopping at all, but expanding my imagination for what a brand can be.